Hey everyone, Professor Davis here, and in this video we're going to explore photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a type of energy transformation. It is similar to the energy transformation we talked about in the previous video of cellular respiration. But guys, solar energy from the sun is going to be converted into chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. So a plant or other types of producers are able to take the energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy. Photosynthetic organisms are also known as producers because they produce this energy, and or what we call autotroph. Now, autotroph means self-feeders. They're able to make their own food. Some examples of photosynthetic organisms, or what we call photoautotrophs, include plants from the kingdom Plantae, algae from Protista, and cyanobacteria from the domain Bacteria. Now remember that Plantae and algae are both eukaryotes, and they contain the special organelle for photosynthesis called chloroplasts. However, cyanobacteria, being a prokaryotic cell, does not have organelles, therefore it does not have chloroplasts. It has a lot of these same enzymes and stuff that we're going to talk about that go into the process of photosynthesis, but they're not found in the actual chloroplast. They're found in the membrane of the cell. All right, so a quick summary here of photosynthesis is that photosynthesis requires a couple of things. For one, it requires sunlight, it requires carbon dioxide, and water. Okay, so those are the three things that have to go into photosynthesis. Well, what are the products that come out? Well, we have oxygen as well as carbohydrates. The most common type of carbohydrate in this case is glucose. All right, so our four inputs required for photosynthesis are going to be solar energy, photosynthetic pigments, and in this case it's mostly chlorophyll, and that's what gives the plants that green color, but it could be other pigments. We also have water, which is H2O, and carbon dioxide, which is CO2. All right, so these are the four inputs or reactants that are going to go into photosynthesis. So let's talk about each of them in detail, and let's start first with that idea of solar energy. Solar or radiant energy is going to travel in waves. These wavelengths of solar energy are measured in what we call nanometers. It's a billionth of a meter. They're pretty small. It is the solar radiation that's in the visible light range that you see on this chart here. This very small sliver called the visible light range is the one where we can actually absorb and use during photosynthesis. All right, so plants, algae, other organisms are able to use that very small area of visible light in order to do photosynthesis. This visible light spectrum goes from 380 nanometers to 750 nanometers. Solar energy is captured by those photosynthetic pigments. These photosynthetic pigments are going to capture the light, and the light then is going to be used to charge up or excite the electrons. Now guys, if you look down here at the actual spectrum that we see for radiation, for this idea of wavelengths, you can see that there are multiple things on each side. So let's start over here with the low energy waves that are going to be the radio waves. Radio waves do travel in waves, but you don't look up there and see them. You're not like, oh, there's that radio station and there's that radio station. But because they're very long, low energy waves, they can travel super long distances. We then have microwaves. Microwaves are exactly what they are. They're the waves that are used in your microwave, okay, that heat up your food, okay? We then have infrared, and it gets its name because it is below red. If you notice, red is the next area on that spectrum. So infrared is below red. Now, these all have lower energy levels. So red is going to be the lowest color of energy that we have here. Now, remember your colors of the rainbow. This is going to be the visible light spectrum, and we call that Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow for Roy. G is green, and Biv is blue, indigo, and violet. Now on the violet side, above violet is ultraviolet waves. Ultraviolet waves have a lot more energy, and they do have the ability to cause cancer. Above that, you have X-rays, and those are the rays that we use for X-ray technology. And then you have gamma rays. Now, gamma rays are not going to turn you into the Hulk. Gamma rays are going to mutate your cells and cause cancer because these are very high energy waves. Now, photosynthetic pigments in plants that are found in the chloroplast, they're there for a number of reasons, but the main one is to absorb different wavelengths of the visible light spectrum. They're going to absorb the light so that it can charge those electrons. Because there's various wavelengths of visible light to absorb, we have Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. There's various pigments that are going to be present. Now, the green ones are called the chlorophylls. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and these are the major pigments in most plants. However, some plants also will have yellow-orange pigments, and these are known as carotenoids. Carotenoids are beta-carotenes or xanthophylls, and they are going to be accessory pigment. A lot of times the carotenoids are seen in the fall when the chlorophyll breaks down, and this is when our leaves change color to yellow, orange, and red. Okay. Now, when we look at this, in the fall, you can see the different pigments found in leaves because chlorophyll, like I said, breaks down and no longer masks the accessory pigments. So this is what happens when we talk about the absorption of light. This one shows you chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids and what kind of pigments they're able to absorb. So which light wavelengths do these pigments collectively absorb the best? Well, they're going to absorb the violet and blue side very well. And they absorb the red and orange for the most part, especially when we're talking about the chlorophyll. The wavelengths that they do not absorb very well is the green. And guys, this is why plants look green, because all the other light's being absorbed and the green is being reflected back to your eye and you're seeing the green. Okay, so this is why most plants appear to be green to us, because that green is being reflected back to us while all the other colors are being absorbed. Now, white light, guys, is the best light for plants to be in because it has all the visible wavelengths of light and it's able to then be able to absorb what it needs. Remember, we can take white light and pass it through a prism and you get all of the colors. Black, however, all visible wavelengths are absorbed, and that makes it more difficult. This is why, guys, when you wear a black shirt outside, it absorbs all of the light and it makes it hot faster, versus when you wear a light colored shirt and it reflects all of the colors. So which color of shirt would you probably not wear on the hot day? Well, I would say the black shirt, because it would make you hotter faster. Unless you want to be hot, and then wear that one. All right, so plants absorb and use only solar energy in the visible light range, which we just talked about. White light contains all the colors, and the wavelengths in the visible light spectrum most efficiently absorbed and used are going to be the violets and blues, as well as the orange and the reds. The wavelength in the visible light spectrum least efficiently used are the greens. What color would plants be if they used all the colors of light? If they absorbed every bit of it? They would be black, like this particular page. If they absorbed every bit of light and they used all of it for photosynthesis, they would all appear black. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the other two inputs, which is water and carbon dioxide. So guys, water, H2O, is the reactant required during the first phase of photosynthesis. And we're going to talk about the first phase and the second phase of photosynthesis in a minute. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the reactant required during the second phase of photosynthesis. Now, where does the plant get water? Plants get the water by absorbing them from their roots, but they have to transport the water from their roots up to the leaves, because the leaves are where photosynthesis is going to take place. And where do plants get the CO2? They get the CO2 from the air around them, so they're going to absorb them through these tiny little holes on the underside of their leaves called stoma or stomata. Now, water and carbon dioxide have to be supplied to the plant by the environment. This is why watering plants is so important. So concepts here. Plant pigments absorb the wavelengths of solar energy from the visible light spectrum. In order for plants to be efficient at photosynthesis, plants have to do different pigments to absorb different wavelengths of visible light. So the more pigments that a plant has, the better they're going to do photosynthesis normally. And the solar energy captured by the photosynthetic pigments of the plant are going to be converted into chemical energy. And ultimately, they're going to make it into carbohydrates. All right, so this makes us look at a closer look at the chloroplast. Now, guys, the chloroplast, remember, does have a double membrane. This double membrane is going to surround these poker chip type structures called thylakoids. We got these poker chip-like structures called thylakoids or discs. And if we have a stack of them, they're known as grana. Okay. The fluid that's inside of the chloroplast is known as stroma. Okay. So you have the thylakoids and you have the stroma. Now, the first stage of photosynthesis is going to take place in the thylakoids. Light has to go in as well as water, H2O. This H2O water is going to get converted into oxygen. So H2O is going to lose its hydrogens and get converted into oxygen. Those hydrogens are then going to go to the Kelvin cycle by the transport of NADPH. The Kelvin cycle is going to have an input of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is going to pick up these hydrogens and it's going to help form the sugar, CH2O. So these hydrogens are going to be transferred. So let's talk about what happens in the thylakoids versus the stroma. The first stage of photosynthesis occurs in the thylakoids. This is where the photosynthetic pigments are going to be located. This is why they're green in the picture. These are associated with what we call photosystems. Now, guys, photosystems are responsible for absorbing light. Just like an antenna on an old TV or radio is going to help pick up the station, it's going to help absorb those waves. Same thing here. These photosynthetic pigments are going to absorb those waves in the photosystems. In this particular case, when we talk about the first stage, this is going to help generate ATP and NADPH. Now, guys, you'll notice this looks very similar to NAD, okay, that was found in cellular respiration. It is. We're going to add the P here, though, for photosynthesis. Now, it doesn't mean photosynthesis, but that's what we're going to think of. When you hear NADPH, that is the carrier molecule for photosynthesis. Now, the stroma is going to be important in the second stage of the photosynthesis. So this is the liquid portion. The contents here are tons of enzymes. Enzymes are going to be the important factor here in this Kelvin cycle. This is associated with that Kelvin cycle, and the ATP and NADH are going to be used here. So if you'll notice, the stuff coming out of the thylakoids is going to help the next step for the stroma. So that's going to constantly be going back and forth between the two of these processes. Now, the first stage of photosynthesis is also going to take water in and oxygen's going to come out. This is going to happen through oxidation because we are removing hydrogens here. This is also known as the light-dependent reaction. It depends on solar energy, so it can only run during the day when light is present. It absorbs solar energy and transforms it to chemical energy. This is going to be where it forms ATP as well as NADPH. The second stage of the Kelvin cycle is going to be driven by this ATP and NADPH. And this CO2 is going to pick up those hydrogens from NADPH, and we're going to convert it into CH2O. This process is known as reduction because we are accepting the hydrogen. This is known as the light-independent reaction because it can run during the day or night. And sometimes the Kelvin cycle is referred to as the dark reaction. This converts inorganic molecules like CO2 into organic molecules, CH2O. Now, guys, remember, definition, organic molecules mean they have to have carbon and hydrogen. And so this is where when the hydrogens get added to CO2, it becomes an organic molecule. So let's take a little closer look at the general equation of photosynthesis. Oxidation, remember, is the loss of electrons or hydrogen atoms, and reduction is the gain of these things. So during the first stage, we're going to take the hydrogens away from H2O, and we are going to then convert that to oxygen. That's the first stage, which is the oxidation stage. Then the CO2 is going to pick up the hydrogens in the second stage, and this is the reduction that takes place. So one way to remember this is called oil rig, where oxidation is losing the hydrogens, whereas reduction is when you gain them. Okay, and so the acronym there is oil rig. So which reactant is being oxidized? That would be the water. And which reactant is being reduced? That would be the carbon dioxide. So what carries these electrons from one molecule to the next? What's going to carry these hydrogens and electrons from one side of the equation to the other side? Well, this is the role of the coenzyme NADP. This is going to carry the electrons. So NADP is going to become NADPH when it picks up the hydrogens, when it becomes reduced. It's going to carry these hydrogens to the dark reaction, to the Kelvin cycle, where it's going to drop off the electrons and the hydrogens and it becomes oxidized. So there's a back and forth that takes place. Say the reduction of NADP to NADPH happens in the first step, which is the light reaction. The oxidation of NADPH back to NADP is going to happen in the Kelvin cycle. And so it is a constant back and forth between the light reaction and the dark reaction, also known as the Kelvin cycle. All right, so the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. Let's look at the details a little bit deeper. This is the first stage of photosynthesis, and water is going to be converted into oxygen. These hydrogens are going to supply the electrons to generate energy, and this occurs in the thylakoids of the chloroplast. The visible wavelengths of solar energy are trapped by the photosynthetic pigments in these thylakoid structures, and they are going to transfer them to the photosystems. Most plants use two photosystems. We call them photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Two major purposes of the photosystems on the thylakoid membrane is first to capture the solar energy and then to charge up the electron. So if you look here, the photosystem down here at the bottom captures the sunlight and it charges the electrons. See how they went up? And then those electrons actually go down like a little bit of a slide. And then they go to the next photosystem, which then charges them again before. Guys, it's very similar to the technology we use in roller coasters. When you get on that roller coaster and it's like tick, 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 and then you finally then go over the edge, we had to put energy into it. And that's what you're doing with this electron. Then you're able to then go over the edge. Or like when you climb up the slide, you climbed up, when you sit down, then you slide down. And it's the same concept that you see here. We're going to give the electrons energy and then we're going to let them loose. And then we're going to give them energy and then we're going to let them loose. This is that electron transport system. Now, ultimately, ATP is going to be generated on these thylakoid membranes through the electron transport system or chain, which is very similar to what we saw in cellular respiration. And NADPH is going to be the one who is carrying these hydrogens and electrons. So putting it all together, guys, is if you look here, you can see that light comes in here to photosystem 2. It excites the electrons and they move through those little blue proteins. They eventually end up in photosystem 1 where they get more energy again, and then they move till they get picked up by NADP. This now becomes NADPH. In this process, these hydrogens are broken off, and the hydrogens are going to help turn ATP synthase, just like we saw in cellular respiration, in order to help generate ATP. Now, that ATP and those NADPHs are going to go to the next step, which is the Kelvin cycle. The Kelvin cycle is the second stage, and this is where CO2 is going to gain hydrogens and become CH2O. This occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast, the liquid. This is also known as the dark reaction or the independent reaction because it does not require direct sunlight. It does require energy input in the form of NADPH and ATP. Those are generated from the light reaction, the light-dependent reaction of the first stage, but they don't need sunlight directly. This second phase does not directly require light, so it usually can occur during the day or it could occur at night. All right, so reduction of CO2 into CH2O occurs in 3 stages. Stage 1 is what we call Co2 fixation. So carbon dioxide fixation, and you can see it here in kind of this bluish turquoise color. In this particular step, the enzyme rubisco, okay, it's an enzyme, rubisco, incorporates carbon dioxide into an organic molecule. It's catalyzing a reaction between CO2 and RUBP. Now, guys, think about this. CO2 is a gas. How hard is it to hold on to a gas? It's very difficult. So plants are going to capture this CO2, and it's going to do this by attaching it to RUBP. It's going to fix it so it cannot get away. Okay, so carbon dioxide, because it's a gas, is going to be fixed to RUBP. Okay, so it's going to be fixed. The second stage is the reduction of CO2. The reduction means we're going to add hydrogens to it. Remember, reduction means we're adding the hydrogens and the electrons. So now CO2 is going to be reduced in this second step. So carbon dioxide reduction. Now, in the third step, this CO2 that's been reduced, some of it's going to leave and help form that sugar. You can see the glucose coming out the bottom. However, this is a cycle, so we have to keep it going. In order to keep it going, we have to regenerate the RUBP so it can capture another carbon dioxide. So the remaining G3P that's left over is going to regenerate this RUBP so that it can do carbon fixation again. This way the Kelvin cycle continues. Okay, so we have 3 steps. Carbon dioxide fixation, CO2 or carbon dioxide reduction, and regeneration of RUBP. So a quick note here, guys, ADP and NADP get recharged in the first stage of photosynthesis. So we use it here. We drop off that H from NADPH. We use the energy from ATP to make the cycle go. But this then goes back to the light reaction to get recharged. All right, so guys, if we look at this, as it goes through the cycle and CO2 comes in, we are going to fix it with adding it to RUBP. This is going to take a 1C for the CO2, combine it to a C5. This then breaks into 2 PG molecules. These are both going to have 3 carbons to them. These are going to come in contact through carbon dioxide reduction, where the use of ATP and NADPH happens. This is going to create a molecule called G3P. For every 6 molecules of G3P that are generated, 5 of them get recycled. They are going to help regenerate RUBP. 1 of them gets to leave the Kelvin cycle and be used by the cell in order to help make a carbohydrate. So G3P is an important product or output of the Kelvin cycle. It serves as the building block for many important organic molecules, specifically carbohydrates first, but it could be used to build other things. And examples of the fate of G3P that leave the Kelvin cycle could be that they become part of glucose. They then could be put into sucrose to be transported, starch to be stored, or cellulose to form structural components like cell walls. We also see G3P could be used to help make fatty acids, especially the glycerol part. And they can also be used and converted to help form amino acids. Now, guys, it does take 2 G3Ps to form 1 glucose molecule. This means the Kelvin cycle has to turn twice to make 1 glucose molecule. All right. What about plants who live in harsh conditions? Ones who don't get water on a regular basis, or sunlight is really harsh, where it could cause some issues with this whole idea of the Kelvin cycle, or even this idea of photosynthesis in general. Well, plants have different adaptations. So there's 3 main categories of plants that we're going to briefly talk about here. The difference here is based on the Kelvin cycle. Plants fix carbon dioxide into their Kelvin cycle differently due to their different environments they live in. Okay, so C3 plants are the ones we just talked about. They're the normal plants and do normal types of Kelvin cycle and photosynthesis. They live in moderate temperatures where the temperature is not too extreme. They also get lots of rainfall. Some examples of these are tulips, maples, and azaleas. They are able to fix carbon dioxide during the day. No problems. Okay. And there is a limitation though, because if the weather does get too hot, these plants can go into what we call photorespiration. And guys, photorespiration means it's too hot and they're losing out on their carbon dioxide out of their stomata as well as water. Water is leaving too quickly. And so because of that, they can't continue photosynthesis. Now, if this happens on a regular basis, these plants need to have a way to adapt, and they would not survive in those environments. And this is where we get C4 plants and CAM plants. So guys, C4 plants live in warmer and drier conditions. These are things like sugarcane, corn, and even Bermuda grass. They can fix CO2 during the day as well, but they're going to do it differently. What happens here is CO2 is going to be added to what we call PEP. And it's going to be added here through an enzyme called pepcase. Pepcase then, with CO2 and PEP, allows for oxaloacetate to form. This is a 4-carbon chain. The limitation here, guys, is that it costs a lot more ATP to do this. Okay, and so they have to use a lot more ATP to accomplish the same task that a C3 plant would do. Okay, and so the cost is greater for C4 plants. On the other hand, the last type of plant are called CAM plants. CAM plants live in hot, dry climates. These are like cacti, succulents. These are the types of plants that we have around here where I live in New Mexico. Okay, they are going to fix CO2 at night. It is too hot during the day for those particular cells to leave their stomata, those holes on their leaves, open all day. They would lose way too much water through evaporation. So they have to close off those stomata. Okay, so they have to close off those stomata. This means that they have a day shift and a night shift. The light reaction takes place during the day, and the Kelvin cycle is going to take place at night. Now, pepcase is also important here. It does the same thing that we saw for the C4. But the limitation too is the ATP cost is great, and they have to make sure they capture enough CO2 at night, because during the day they're going to close off those stomata. All right, so there's a different cost that's present. And guys, this is one reason why sometimes those plants will grow slower. Okay, because they're not able to produce as much ATP on a regular basis. So plants have adaptations. Remember, we talked about one thing of being a living thing means they have to respond to their environment. Here's a response. They've changed how they do photosynthesis just a little bit in order for them to survive in those different environmental conditions. All right, and so this gives you a little bit of an idea. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time here. If this interests you, you should take a botany class where they really focus in on how this works with photosynthesis, and you get to explore plants a lot further. All right, so let's do a brief review of this energy cycle. The overall reaction for photosynthesis is the reverse or opposite reaction of cellular respiration. All right, so guys, this first one, 6 CO2 plus 6 water is going to be converted into glucose and oxygen. That's photosynthesis. Whereas the opposite, where I have 6 oxygen plus sugar, is converted into 6 CO2 and 6 water. That is cellular respiration. Photosynthesis produces oxygen as a byproduct, whereas cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide as its byproduct. Every single atom in this is conserved. So whatever was in one side, number-wise, has to be in the product side. Substances change form or move from one molecule to another, but they never disappear completely. And then also photosynthesis and respiration function together in biological cycles. This allows organisms to survive and access energy that comes from millions of miles away. Ultimately, remember, the sun. So all energy ultimately came from the sun. So plants, algae, cyanobacteria, they do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Animals like us, we only do cellular respiration. All right, so this kind of completes our overview of photosynthesis. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know.